You're listening to the Deerfield Public Library podcast, April 25th, 2023.
And for me, reading was my escape.
Welcome to the Deerfield Public Library podcast, where we have conversations with authors, artists, and other notable people from Chicagoland and around the world. I'm your host, Dylan Zavagno, Adult Services Coordinator here at the library. And in this episode, we're presenting the recording of a live podcast event and book signing we hosted a couple weeks ago on April 13th with Lisa Barr, author of the best-selling thriller Woman on Fire, which came out last year in 2022. I introduced Lisa during the event, so we'll jump right into the conversation. The only thing you should know is that Lisa Barr is our hometown hero here. She lives in Deerfield. And since this was recorded live, you'll hear the sounds of an enthusiastic audience of readers, fans, book groups, and book bloggers, friends, family, and neighbors, and even a couple audience questions at the end. It was a really fun evening. Here's my conversation with Lisa Barr. I think we're ready to begin.
Can I just say a few
Please.
thank yous?
Yes.
First to this guy. Look at this preparation here. Can you see that? He's amazing, and I really appreciate it. And this is my hometown library, so this means so much. I mean, I'm such a mushball that I'm already actually feeling it. But my two of my daughters are in New York right now, and one is here in Deerfield. And I told my two, I'm like, I've got a gig at the Deerfield Library. And it's just, I mean, I took my girls here to get books, so it's really an honor. And I just wanted to say a special shout out. We've got an amazing book blogger. So if you're interested in books and the behind the scenes, right there, Jenny Scher, Book Coffee Happy, is like, she's our hometown girl who really goes behind the scenes and gives the real deal on books. And she's amazing. So follow her if you're into Instagram and all that stuff. And she's got a great blog. So thank you for showing up tonight. And my brother and sister-in-law right there. So, and my husband, oh my God, my husband, he has been to so many. This is my 172nd event, a book gig, since Woman on Fire has begun. So it's really a little bit crazy, and I'm so happy to be here with you. So do your thing, Dylan.
Okay, I don't even know if I need to introduce Lisa anymore, but I will read her bio here. So Lisa Barr is the New York Times bestselling author of Woman on Fire from 2022, the Unbreakables from 2019, and the historical thriller Fugitive Colors from 2013, which was the IPPY Gold Medal, which I believe is an Independent Publishers Award, right. Best Literary Fiction 2014, and first prize at the Hollywood Film Festival, Opus Magnum Discovery Award. In addition, Lisa served as an editor for the Jerusalem Post, managing editor of Today's Chicago Woman, managing editor of Moment magazine, and as an editor-reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times. We'll be talking about a few of these different things here, but you've already told us this is 172.
Yeah,
okay.
my book tour finishes in June, and then I hand in my new manuscript, and I'm taking the summer off.
Oh, good for you. Yeah, I think that well-deserved. So one of the things we do here as a library podcast is have a local angle to the authors and subjects we cover. Because we're a library, we also serve to preserve memories. So we're an institution, local institution, that can have that archive of who we are, right? As readers, as cultural producers and writers ourselves here in this time. So I want to ask you and start this whole conversation by asking about another local institution that inspired you, the Art Institute of Chicago. You have mentioned that this exhibit in 1991 on the degenerate art, this was what the Nazis called it, right? Entartete Kunst.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And there were all these paintings stolen and then exhibited as examples of bad art.
Yep.
Right? And out of the 100 12 artists I have written down, only 6 were Jews, but this was considered culturally infecting the German people. And just some of the artists, Henri Matisse, Marc Chagall, Pablo Picasso, Vincent van Gogh, it must have been shocking to see this kind of put up, the paintings we still have left at the time in 91. So just tell us, what was that like? How old were you? Who were you with when you saw this? Yeah.
So this was 1991, as you mentioned, and this is before Monuments Men. This is before Woman in Gold. And just to say from the outset, I'm a daughter of a Holocaust survivor. So at the time, I was a young journalist, and I was sent on an assignment. So I thought this was just going to be, I'm going to the Art Institute. It was called The Fate of the Avant-Garde in Nazi Germany. And I thought I was just going to cover it, give the color, the background, the who, what, where, when, why, and how to a story and turn it in. So this moment for me was my aha moment. I walked in there and I saw, I think it was 150 masterpieces, as you mentioned, major artists. And these paintings were deemed deplorable, illegal, degenerate by the Nazis. And particularly, the Nazis went after the German Expressionists, which were a homegrown movement of avant-garde art. And so they went after the Expressionists with, a vengeance never seen before. And what is, just briefly, Expressionism? So Expressionism, for those who don't know, is how a painting makes you feel. So it's not the subject. You're not going to have, a fruit bowl or Monet's Garden of Giverny. You're going to have wild, roiling brushstrokes. Love it or hate it, you're going to feel something when you see an Expressionist painting. And this movement of art was the movement that the Nazis went after between 1933 and 1945 with a vengeance never seen before. So when I walked in there and I saw these incredible works of art that I, had read about, I had learned about, and that these were deemed illegal. And as you mentioned, only 6 were Jewish artists. It wasn't about the Jewish art. It was about the avant-garde.
Yeah, some of them had their own German identity. They wanted to promote their vision of Germany.
Absolutely. Yeah. But it was against the Germany that Hitler, was an anti-Aryan type of art. So for me, when I walked in there and saw this, I had this reaction, my hair stood on ends, I was like, my blood felt like it was rushing. And in that moment, I knew not only that I was covering a story, I had found my story. And it would, from that moment on in 1991, I began to deep dive into the world of Nazi-looted art.
So I have to tell you, I did my librarian research thing.
Now that sounds scary.
It is. I found an exhibition catalog for this Art Institute exhibit. And it was amazing reading from now, because at the time there were all these debates over the National Endowment for the Arts. And they were saying, isn't this disturbing that we're getting all this pushback? And it was partially funded by the National Endowment for the Arts. And we should have a culture that's open to all of this art. So the exhibit was also partially funded by the Nathan Cummings Foundation. Now, Nathan Cummings was a very prominent art collector. He was also the owner of the Sara Lee Corporation. For those of you who've been in Deerfield a long time, you'll know that the Sara Lee Bakery was here in Deerfield. Nathan Cummings donated artwork to the library. So this painting right behind us here is by Picasso's nephew, Javier Villato. So here is another second-generation painting that was coming here to the library. And I thought, well, this is, of course, fun to share because I did my own search for art. But it's not just that. I was thinking to past guests that we've had on the library podcast, We've had Howard Reich talking about his book, his long friendship with Elie Wiesel. Ken Crimstein, who grew up here, wrote a graphic novel about Hannah Arendt, who escaped the Nazis. We had early in the podcast Chasing Portraits, a great-granddaughter's quest for her lost art legacy by Elizabeth Reinecke. We've had a lot of interest in the community, so I would say it's part of our identity, or it should be, in Deerfield, that we are a site that can hold this memory, can be a place where survivors and their children and their children's children can live and thrive. And art is one of the ways that we preserve that memory.
No, I commend you for that, and especially in a time of surging anti-Semitism, this means everything. So I'm grateful for that.
Can you tell us about your father?
Yes, well, so my father came to this country when he was 13, and actually my grandmother, his mother, so his immediate family survived, and my grandmother, Grandma Rachel, who I've dedicated this book to, if you look at the dedication in the front, she was my best friend. She's the voice in my head. She's the reason that I write what I write. And this is a woman who lost her parents, all her siblings, her aunts and uncles. Everyone perished in Auschwitz. She survived. And she lived with so much joy. And so it was such a joy for her to, see her legacy, her grandchildren, her children, her grandchildren, to, raise, a family, that education was so important. And so, but more than that, to me, we would loop our arms and we'd take a walk around her park and we would talk about life. And she always taught me to stand up for things that I believed in. So she's the voice in my head, and as I mentioned, and why I sort of veer toward World War II stories. And so, yes, my father, but I would have to say my grandmother. And just as a tidbit, if, without giving away any spoilers in the book, there's a character in the book. Her name is Lillian Dassel. And I love her. And she is my grandmother. So she's based on my grandmother in the book.
That's so wonderful.
Yeah.
There's a quote in the book at one point. The young journalist who's obsessed, she has this idol, Dan Mansfield.
Yes.
And they say, Dan says, well, you know what I always say, what doesn't kill you, and Jules finishes his sentence, makes you write about it.
Right.
And I think you can hear a little bit about that, but I guess I would just wonder in your own family if art or culture, reading, writing, was important to you as a way of maybe addressing these impossible but impossibly important things?
No, I think art is a way for me, I had a tough childhood, and, my parents got divorced, and for me, reading was my escape. It was, I read, multiple books a week, and I had a journal since I was, in fourth grade, and that was my way of, dealing with some things that were hard at home, and then I fell in love with reading and writing. And if you look at my essay, I think it was in second grade, what do you want to be when you grow up, in my second grade class, one of my kindergarten teachers are here right there.
That's amazing.
And yes. So it said, I want to write books.
Yeah.
And so I have been a writer from the get-go, and a voracious reader from the get-go. Every great writer is a reader. So artistically, in my family, for sure, art was, a way of expression, and art, for me, was a little bit of a way of escape as well.
Yeah, and maybe a way of feeling things, like these German expressionists, right?
Yes.
So I'm going to quote from your first book here, Fugitive Colors. This is this character, Ernst Engel.
Yes.
And he shows up in Women on Fire as well. So Painting, he continued, does not have to be object-related. Things are obsolete. It's the emotion that is essential. Lose your perspective. It isn't necessary. You are not describing reality, my friends, but interpreting it. Do you understand? Smell the cool forest behind Charlotte, sharp like menthol. Listen to the sway of the trees. Experience the wind tickling your skin. That is what I want you to paint. The emotion, how it makes you feel. That is why I brought you here to my home, to my forest. Now make it yours. So tell us, Ernst Engel, we're told he founded the Die Brücke movement, which seems to be based on Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, who founded Die Brücke in real life. Is that true? What was the research like about
Okay, so first of all, you did your homework.
Okay,
love that.
Thank you, yes.
Okay, so...
I'm a good student.
You are a really good student. So thank you. Thank you for that. So Ernst Engel, a lot of writers, they'll work on books, and for me and friends of mine, you dream about them, you feel them, you know them, whether they're women, they're men, different characters. So I fell in love with Ernst Engel. He is a composite of the founders of Expressionism. And so without spoiling, he is murdered by the Nazis, and his last known work is Woman on Fire. And that's what they call, in our business, inserting an Easter egg into your next book. And so sometimes it's really hard to let go of characters. And so I thought to myself, I really wanted to bring him into the next novel. So, his words were meaningful to me then. I internalize them in the different things, or the different scenes, and the way that I write. And it's funny, I just wrote an article, How to Write a Great Sex Scene. Okay? So
there's some good ones in
it. This is I just wrote an essay about it, but this comes back to this point. And so the best sex scenes in books are not really about the sex. It's about everything around it and how it moves the plot forward, and so you really need to use all five senses to describe in a chapter, because I might see it, I might write it, but in order for the reader to feel it, to taste it, to smell it, they have to get all those senses inside of the chapter. And so, for example, my second book, The Unbreakables, we went to a magical place, St. Paul de Vence. And so that is very sensory-oriented. But because I was there, it was very important to me that I bring the reader there, that there's no BS making it up, but to really bring the reader there. So I try to do that in all of my books, bring those senses to do what Ernst Engel discussed in Fugitive Colors into all of my works, actually.
It was amazing reading some of Kirchner's words, because it mirrors those so well. He says things like, everyone who reproduces directly and without illusion whatever he senses, the urge to create belongs to us. Kirchner also said people become artists out of despair. So later in Fugitive Colors, I have to ask you about this. A student of Ernst Engel's, Julian, he's naked in front of his canvas and he's wildly painting. And later he calls this painting Man on Fire. And he says, I call it Man on Fire because it explores the concept of rage, which I believe to be the most powerful of human emotions. So there's a man on fire and a woman on fire. How did that all happen?
So this is going to sound crazy. So I was, at a book event or a book club, and someone brought up Man on Fire. And I'm thinking to myself, Man on Fire, what's Man on Fire? And then so when you move to your next book and the next book after that, like right now I'm knee deep into my book after Woman on Fire, you're in those lives. And so it must have been subconsciously, because I realized that the major painting in Fugitive Colors was Man on Fire. And then cutting that off completely, I created Woman on Fire. And it took one of my readers to point it out. And sometimes you forget those patterns. But I will say it makes sense.
Yeah.
Because man on fire, woman on fire, rage, passion, those are the things that sort of guide all my books. It's a thread throughout all of the journeys of each book.
I have to interrupt you to talk about this moment in the Unbreakables where the character Sophie, right, and she's from North Grove, which is
a made-up suburb,
sure. Her husband cheats on her. She goes to France,
the south of France, right?
Rediscovering her sensuality, her sexuality, and her love of painting. And at one point, she is stabbing a painting of herself and being urged to stab it. Can I read the section here? It's so fun. I raise the knife high overhead and I stab right through the center of the canvas. Again, she shouts from behind me, my rage coach. The other one too, let out all that pain, all that anger. I stab my painting first. Then I turn to the one she did of me. It's simple in form, painted with black fluid lines and bright splashes of color like a Matisse. And it looks like me. I don't hesitate. I stab it right through its belly, then repeat again and again, each thrust becoming increasingly violent.
Yes. I'm not really an angry person.
I think you are. I think you're putting it all in the books here.
Maybe I am. Because, it's funny. Everyone will say, who do you love to write? And honestly, you could ask 9 out of 10 authors, we love writing about our evil character. So when I would come to Woman on Fire and it was a Margot day, it was just the best. So because I think you can't be that, in real life, but in books and through characters, you can put your darkest impulses or the rage you feel. But I think really the thread through all 3 of my novels and the next one coming up, we can talk about it, but it's how far would you go for your passion? Would you kill for it? Would you steal for it? Or would you do anything to protect it at all costs, like Jules Roth, the protagonist in Woman on Fire. And also Julian would protect it at all costs. But it's really how far would you go for your passion? So there's rage. There's a lot that goes into passion and fire.
So it struck me that the Degenerate art exhibit was about defining the German public in opposition to these works of expressionism. But in Woman on Fire, you have all of these different characters who are defining themselves with and through this painting of expressionism. It's like reversing that. Like, we're all going to be identified, and you're going to have rage, you're going to have passion, you're going to have all of these different motivations, money, sex, all these things. Can you just maybe tell us a little bit about the plot for people who haven't read it and how all of these characters cannot help but be so moved by this painting?
Okay, yes. So Woman on Fire, it's a tale of a savvy young journalist who gets embroiled in a major international art scandal centered around a Nazi-looted masterpiece. So the difference is, just to kind of circle your question, so Fugitive Colors is about the artists themselves. Woman on Fire is about the art, the painting, and its story. And so my goal was to showcase the more than 600,000 works of art that the Nazis looted, destroyed, confiscated, and to showcase the journey of one painting. I sometimes think when the numbers are too huge, people can't feel it, almost in a Schindler's List type of way when you bring it to one family. So I felt sort of through an intergenerational scope where you have Ellis, who's, in his 80s. You have Jules, who's in her 20s. You have Margot, who's in her 30s. And you have everyone whose lives center around, trying to find this painting because it means something to each of them. So it's really the journey of how this painting moves through hands, hearts, and history. And people say, who's the protagonist of this book? So, from the outset, it looks like it's Jules Roth, the young journalist, but really the protagonist is Woman on Fire herself, the painting, and they all revolve around it. So, that was what was intended in my mind, how to move the plot, move everything along by chasing, like physically chasing this painting to get it back. And, the painting itself is a composite of real artwork. And my inspiration for it...
Please tell us, yeah.
So I don't know if you've heard of this story that broke in the art world. It was in 2013 and was called the Munich Art Horde. And so this story sent shockwaves in the art world. And what it was, in a dilapidated, rundown apartment in Munich, there was a very old man who lived there, a recluse, an agoraphobic, we would call him in our days. And basically, he was living with 1,500 masterpieces worth $1.5 billion. And who is this guy? So the paintings are literally in his stove, layered like lasagna. We're talking Cezanne, Picasso, Matisse, and ask me about the Matisse in a second.
Okay,
I'll tell you about it. And so, and shoved in his cabinet between tins of food, hundreds of masterpieces. Well, it turns out, that his name was Cornelius Gurlitt. Yeah. And in my book, where it begins, without giving away anything, is Karl Geisler. It's in the beginning. And it turns out that his father his name was Hildebrand Gurlitt, and that he was one of Hitler's 4 assigned art dealers to deal with Nazi-looted art, degenerate art. And so Hildebrand amassed this huge treasure trove, was killed in a car accident in the 70s, and bequeathed this whole trove to his reclusive son. And so and there's a whole story that goes around it.
It's fascinating, yes.
So when I read this, I was like, oh my God, I found my story. What if I could create a unscrupulous art dealer who would go and rob this treasure trove? Is it a crime to rob the robber? And so there I was. That's where it catapulted from there. And so that was the inspiration. And being a journalist, my background, every book I write has a news hook to it. So this was the news hook.
Oh, very good. Okay. Well, I wanted to ask you about Jules,
yes.
The character. She's young, in her 20s. She's very excited to be a journalist, and she gets her start by being used as bait to uncover a sex trafficking ring. This is actually part of your real-life story. Fill us in. This is just, what was this like? I am so...
So I wrote this book during COVID, so it was dark to begin with. Okay, so it was COVID lockdown. I was working 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, and I decided if I'm going to be locked in, I'm going to write what I love to read, what I love to write. So the book is a bit of a mutt. It's history, it's suspense, it's passion, it's risky journalistic pursuits, and it's strong, fiery women. And so I really felt like I wanted to go back to a time and a place that I loved. And so I sort of went back to Jules, who is the most me of any character I've ever created. And so I went back to when I was a young journalist covering stories in Jerusalem. And this is before kids, before I became old and crusty and jaded. And where I would say, yes to any story that I was assigned, no matter how dangerous, because, when you're young, you don't really see consequences. Now, I would never do half of what I did then, and if any of my 3 daughters did any of this, I would kill them. But at that time,
There's a good mother in this book, too, that helps out.
Yeah, but exactly. So at that time, it was the best time of my life, you know, when you're so carefree. So I decided I was going to like bring Jules as the main character and have her idealistic and innocent and just going after the stories. And then by the end, I was going to coach her through. So at the same time, I decided to give her one of my own backstories. So when I was 17 years old, I was at the time at New Trier High School, and I was on an internship program for 6 months of high school in Springfield, Illinois, working for a state senator. And while I was there, I was approached by a special law enforcement unit. And just, you know, background, this was the time there was no phones, there were no computers.
Oh my gosh.
And so they said, would you be interested in helping us to help, you know, to break a sex trafficking ring to be used as bait? And I was 17 and I said, of course. So at that time, you didn't have, you know, this is the old days, you didn't have to get your parents' permission on anything. In fact, I don't think I told them till 10 years later.
Wow.
So I was used as bait to help break a sex trafficking ring, and we did it. And people were arrested, and it was a big moment as a 17-year-old that I knew at that time I was going to, it was another aha moment, if you will, that I was going to go after the hard stories, go after the truth, no matter what. I didn't know how it was going to pan out, but that was the moment. So I decided, you know, with Jules, it just worked with her character, and I was going to give that to her, that story. So, yeah, that's how it came about.
Jules is so interesting because she gets to be messy in the book. You know, she gets to, like, sleep with people she maybe shouldn't.
Right.
And
she has all the fun.
She has all the fun. But it made me think, too, that that's part of the message of this book is that if the expressionists wanted to express what was underneath the surface of life, what may be scary or violent or messy, that's also part of your rectifying what gets called degenerate, is to kind of put these women out there that we get to love how strong and conniving and messy. And, you know, Jules breaks a few rules in her investigation. She keeps a few secrets for herself. And then when I heard that this was your story too, I thought, oh, Lisa Barr was always a fiction writer. She was writing fiction from her first story, right? You've also talked about being friends with Leah Rabin, who you interviewed right after the assassination of her husband, Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, in their home. So I also wondered if that relationship that you built with her, was that part of an inkling that you wanted to maybe turn away from journalism and towards fiction writing? So
I was always like a journalist. As a journalist, that was my day job. I was, you know, reporter, investigative reporter, and, you know, I was at, you know, so that was my day job. That's how I earned my living. But at night, I would work on my fiction. And that particular story with Leah Rabin, I would have to say it was probably my most meaningful piece because I had just come back from, I had covered at the White House the handshake between Yitzhak Rabin, her husband, the late Yitzhak Rabin, PLO leader Yasser Arafat, and President Bill Clinton. So this was an incredible moment. I was one of 3 reporters from the Jerusalem Post covering this moment, and there was such an excitement in the air, like finally real peace was right there in the Middle East. And so to be able to cover that was beyond exciting. And then we know what happened. Soon after that, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated and everything went south. So I was in Washington at the time. I came back to Chicago for a family event, and I went back to Jerusalem, and right then, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. And so I covered that story for Vogue magazine. You know, Leah Rabin was, you know, as close to high society as you can get. You know, she was friends with Oscar de la Renta and all these, you know, prominent people in the fashion world, political world. And she basically had to carry and mother an entire nation who was in deep mourning after the assassination. And so I interviewed her about a week and a half after, and it was so raw. And I went to their apartment, and she was very stoic and very put together. And then I had asked her one particular question, and I said, Mrs. Rabin, you said you're mothering an entire nation, you know, while you yourself are going through your deepest pain. At night, when you're by yourself, do you believe or do you think he's proud of you, the way you're handling everything? And then her face broke, and she started bawling, and, you know, and then she's crying, and I'm crying, and we just held each other. And, you know, as a journalist, you can be in some very tough situations, but you have to maintain a subject-journalist separation in order to still write the story. I mean, I've covered some tough terrorism stories, and you have to, you know, keep it together. But in this moment, I could not. She's crying, so we held each other, and I think that moment where we were both so human together was a bonding experience, and after that, we stayed friends until her passing. And it was really a moment in terms of journalism. And so, you know, did that lead to my fiction? Your question. I think it in fiction, there's a sensitivity to it. And it's a sensitivity to your characters. Even for those of you who have not read it, even in Margot, who's my evil character, the best evil characters that you can create are those who are not all evil, that the reader can empathize. You can read 90% of them and think...
Sometimes I wanted her to get the painting.
Right, you wanted her to get the painting. But that's exactly it, because the painting was her soft spot. It was her connection to her grandfather, without giving it away, who really cared about her. And so I think that sensitivity as a journalist, I'm able to, you know, jump over and do that in my fiction, or at least I try to do that as well.
You saw the rage again.
There's well, with pain, there's rage. You know, there's all the different steps that you feel. So I think it's all kind of under one big umbrella.
It's amazing, and it's incredibly readable too, right? So I think we have to hear, as we wrap up here, Sharon Stone. Take it from there. So before a book becomes a book, it's an ARC, which is an advanced reader's copy. So ARCs are sent to people like Jenny over there. Yes, we get them at the library.
So you get them at the library, but they're sent out before the book is launched. So, for example, my book was launched on March 1st of last year, and then a few months earlier, people in the book world get a copy of the book, and it's to generate buzz for the book. And so I had this ARC in my hands, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to send it to one celebrity. And so I thought to myself, through a few different things, this author that I love who had given my book a book blurb, which is sort of advanced praise, and her last line had said, "Woman on Fire is Woman on Gold meets Spotlight meets Basic Instinct." And so I thought, you know what? I'm going to send it to Sharon Stone, the original Woman on Fire. So I sent her the book, and this was in October of 2021, and my husband and I were on the couch watching Netflix like everybody else, and all of a sudden I got a text that said, "Hi, it's Sharon Stone. I'm in Dubai, and I love your book. Has it been optioned?" So my first thought, it was one of those people, saying, I'm in Barcelona, I lost all my money, and, and can you send money? And then I remembered that I had sent it to her, and then very soon after, we struck a deal. And so it's been going super slow. So this is, so we'll see what happens. Yeah. But, Hollywood is a strange bird. But she's a lovely human and has been very supportive of Woman on Fire. So with that, I am very grateful.
Well, that's wonderful. Congratulations on the success. Finally, I thought I'd just ask you what you're working on next. You've alluded several times to turning in a manuscript.
Yes, so if you meet an author and she's doing this is the glamour part. Mostly we're like in our sweatpants, our hair's in a scrunchie, we've got our glasses, we look like crap, and we are working. We're in full working mode. And so usually an author is doing this on book tour and also working on the next manuscript because there's always a deadline. So every time I try to leave World War II, I'm pulled back in. Yeah. So the new book is called The Goddess of Warsaw, and it's about a famous femme fatale, think old Hollywood, who's like the most famous femme fatale with a dark, secret past during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And she may or may not have been an assassin. Oh. So what happens in the book, it's 3 timelines, sort of 1943 with the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, 1956, old Hollywood at the height of her fame, and then about now when her past is coming to haunt her. So excellent. That's the new book.
Well, I thought I would just ask you if you have any other thing you want to say to your hometown here.
Oh my God, I love you, Deerfield. No, I have to say, I've traveled the world, and I grew up in Northbrook, and I always swore I will never come back to the North Shore. I will never come back, but it has been the most beautiful community to raise my kids, our kids, that guy over there, our 3 daughters, and I feel very grateful for the education, the community. Just recently there was a young woman, we lost a 25-year-old young woman to cancer, and I am telling you, whether or not you knew her, everyone flocked to this funeral, and it was just all I could think of in that moment was, man, I'm so proud of my community. Like, we stand up and we care about each other. I know, like every community, there's pluses and minuses and problems and this and that, but this is really a beautiful town to raise your kids, and I love our library, and
well, thank you.
Thank you so much for what you do.
Well, thank you very much. I have one little thing I wanted to say, which is that when I first started reading Woman on Fire, I thought, we've represented Holocaust stories, survivor stories, second generation, third generation, and art stories, but we haven't represented the fashion world, which is part of Deerfield. There are many fashionable people here.
Yes.
Right? So I thought that was fun too.
Well,
look at you right now. So.
No, I wanted to say a funny story. So in the book, and I hope this is not a spoiler, but there's a character, he works for Hugo Boss. And so I think a lot of people were surprised to find out that Hugo Boss actually designed the Nazis' uniforms. And I think that comes with the research. You find various tidbits. And so Hugo Boss, the company, later apologized for their Nazi past. And so our eldest daughter lives in New York, and she's in fashion, and she's actually just left fashion recently, but she was for the last few years. So she called me up and she said, oh my God, Mommy, I have a great interview with Hugo Boss. I'm like, don't tell them I'm your mother. So, but that I would have to say I'm a research geek. Yeah. That's my favorite part of writing the books. I love being surrounded by tons of, documents and things like that. And when I found that little tidbit, it was fun to throw in little things that people can walk away with and learn. Yeah. And I think that overall is my goal, that people walk away from the book and you have a knowledge of stolen art. And when you see it in the newspaper, because you're going to see it a lot. 80 years after the war, it's still front page news. But now you'll read my book, and through osmosis, you're really going to get an understanding of Nazi looted art.
Yeah. Yeah, art lasts, as one of the characters says in the book, right?
Yes.
This has been fantastic. Thank you so much, Lisa, for joining us.
How about it for Dylan?
So Lisa will be over at the table. I hope you'll buy out the book bin tonight. There are wonderful local bookstores. Since Barnes & Noble closed, they are our local bookstore too. They're over in Northbrook. It's a lovely little store. Thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And check out our podcast. We have usually about an interview a month up there. So if you enjoyed this, there's tons more. I think this is our 60th interview that we've done.
Oh, wow.
So,
all right, good.
Since 2017. So anyway, thank you so much. Buy books.
Thank
you. Say hi to Lisa. Thank you.
Yes, do you have a question?
Oh, please, yeah. Oh, Matisse.
Oh, Matisse. Oh, my God, thank you. Through books, you meet people. So through Fugitive Colors, my first book, I met this woman who's the granddaughter of the art dealer from Paris that I actually based my art dealer from Paris. And I found her. She lives in New York. And it turns out that in this book, in Woman on Fire, that treasure trove that I mentioned, the Geisler, the Gurlitt treasure trove, in the stove was a Matisse, and that was actually her family's painting. So it took her 9 years to get their $30 million Matisse back. But it's so I had met her with my first book, and then it turns out after this book, and then during the time while I was writing the book, she got her painting back.
Gosh.
It's just so many interesting stories happen while you're working. I mean, I kind of really dig that part of it. So
wow.
Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, one more question.
Yeah.
Can we look forward to your next book?
So I'm turning it in June 15th. And so it's usually a year process where it goes through the edits and all that jazz. So I don't have a publishing date yet, but it will be in 2024.
But you gave us a timeline.
I gave you the timeline. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
You can check out all 3 books by Lisa Barr here at the library, or check out her website, lisabarr.com. That's our show. Thank you so much to Lisa for all her time in planning this special live podcast event. And thank you to all the people who showed up in person, and especially to Allie and Amy of the Book Bin in Northbrook. Thank you for listening to our 59th interview episode. Comments and feedback are always welcome and can be sent to podcast@deerfieldlibrary.org. Go to deerfieldlibrary.org/podcast to learn more about our show and find links to subscribe. You can also follow the library on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, or check out our YouTube channel. Links are on our website or in the show notes. We'll be back next month. Thanks for listening.